Hello, Bonjour and welcome everyone. I'm Jasmine Policki, member of the Native American Heritage Month Planning Committee within the Office of the Multi-Ethnic Student Affairs. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you all and Mr. Joseph Alstein for being here this evening to talk about the work of Ziibimijwang Farm. I'm also honored to begin this exciting program with the land acknowledgement from the comfort of my ancestral territory in Lake, Wisconsin. Bonjour, Gimiwan Nokwe Indigenous, Nigekdonem, Ojibwekwe and Dao, Medwewe, the Wega Nagaming, and Donjaba. We would like to acknowledge that the earth we stand or sit upon provides us with all the necessities of life to sustain our bodies and our spirits. We acknowledge that there exist relationships between us, our plants and animal relatives, and the environment that cannot be reduced to mere systems. We acknowledge that there is a force greater than any of us, unknowable but named, that binds us to one another. We acknowledge that we have been alienated from our authentic selves for far too long, and we thank those who work to reunite us with their authentic selves. As for the University of Michigan, we acknowledge the people named in the 1817 Treaty of Fort Meigs that provided the basis for the university to be founded and funded. The Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe, as well as those who found themselves within the territory for various reasons, and also named in the treaty, the Seneca, Shawnee, the Delaware, and the Wyandot. We also acknowledge that our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained through the disposition of Indigenous people, and that further work is needed to ensure that those treaty terms are respected and met. Miigwech, and I would like to hand it over to our co-chair, Solomon, for the rest of the program. Thank you.
Miigwech, thank you, Jasmine. My name is Solomon, and I'm one of the MESA student coordinators for Native American Heritage Month Planning Committee, and I have the distinct honor of introducing our featured speaker for this evening. Joe Van Alstyne serves as the of Ziibimijwang Incorporated, which 300-acre tribally owned nonprofit farm located in northern Michigan. He is the director of the Little Tribe Odawa food distribution program. And funnily enough, this is the tribe that I'm a part of. So to that, during his spare time, he serves as the Midwest Region President with a seat as Vice President of the National Association of Food Distribution Programs on Indian Reservations. And that represents 276 Indian tribal organizations throughout Indian country. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Van Alstyne from Ziibimijwang Farm.
All right. Thank you, Solomon. Thank you, Solomon, for that great introduction. I hope, this is the standard question. Can everyone hear me? Right. So, all right. Thank you. Let me share that screen there. All right, looks like we're in. So, Ani Buju, Zozep Adishnikas, Waganaxing Odawa Nini, Jamaganash and Dao, Dijak and Dodam, Anishinaabe Ziibing and Doda. My name is Joe Van Alstyne, and I'm from Little Traverse Bay Bands of Dao Indians. I'm a veteran. I'm of the Crane clan, and my spirit hails from Anishinaabe or Indian River, Michigan. So I just want to say thank you all for being here today. I'm glad for the invite to speak today. Being Crane clan, that is one of the things that we're known for, is our ability to speak and be vocal proponents for not only the clans, but our nation as well. So being Crane and all those titles and things that I do to represent the people, is very dear and very dear to me, because it's just something that I really enjoy doing. So without further ado, looking at Ziibimijwang here. This is our fancy logo, and I always like to tell people, you know, with Ziibimijwang, that this logo has came a long ways from the very first notepad drawing. But Ziibi, you know, in our language is river, and we have the Carp River that runs pretty much almost halfway right through our farm, and so we felt it was appropriate to call it Ziibi. Mij, this is the root word for food, and then Wang means place. So here, you know, we've got the place where food grows near the river. On to the next slide here. This here is an excerpt from our award last year in 2019. We won Farmer of the Year award. So I'll just let you guys take a minute and read that. You know, so let me go back there real quick. So Ziibimijwang is the place where food grows near the river. And the reason why I wanted you to read it is so you can really understand it, you know, in your own way. So, but that is where we are reminded that as an Anishinaabe people, we are inseparable from the land. Our land holds the memories of our ancestors and tells our people who we were, who we are, and who we will be. We owe our existence to the resilient ancestors who looked after our land and taught us what it means to be Wagenuxing. We continue to gather here at the place where food grows near the river to continue the work of our ancestors. And just as Jasmine had said earlier, you know, in her land acknowledgement speech, we are connected to the land, and that's who we are. And, you know, just by me talking about it right now, I'm like getting the goosebumps because my body, my blood memory, all of that understands that right there. So on to the next here. Ziibimijwang, you know, this is our mission statement. We do have it in the language and also, you know, Anishinaabe Mowen, but I'll read it to you. Ziibimijwang is committed to restoring and strengthening Menominee of the Odawa community through a foundation of Indigenous food systems and cultural activities. This next slide is a Google photo of Ziibimijwang. If you can look, you can see the Carp River kind of runs right off to the right side. It's 300 acres, and that's roughly 3 square miles right there that encompasses that land. The farm board, Ziibimijwang Inc., we are in control of all of the tillable land that you see there. The forest part is, you know, controlled by our natural resource department. And but you know, we still have the ability to go ahead and, you know, do gathering, hunting. You know, we have hunting blinds all the way out through here, trapping blinds. You know, people can come fish in the river right there. So, but this is just a quick overview of what Ziibimijwang looks like from an aerial perspective. Down here in the left-hand corner, you can see some of the fields that we have worked up last year. But really, 2014, our tribal council, some members of tribal council had went out to Oneida to a food sovereignty summit. And, you know, talk on council is like, you know, what do we do? You know, how do we feed ourselves? And so they ended up going out to the food sovereignty summit. And I mean, it really blew their minds about all the work that's being done in Indian country. And so when they came back, they were like, "Hey, man, let's go ahead and you know, buy a farm." You know, so they put together an agricultural ad hoc work group, and you know, I sat on that group a little bit, you know, just because I am the food distribution program director. But that was, you know, again, like almost what, 10 years ago. Maybe, well, 7 years, but we sat there and, you know, they looked for places, you know, to purchase, and this one came up. This farm used to be owned by a tribal citizen, years and years and years ago, but then they had lost it and sold it to another family, and they turned it into just a plain farm. It was, your traditional farm. It had cows, pigs. It grew hay and crops. So it was a very traditional farm. And then what happened is the people who had owned it, were getting old. And so they ended up retiring, and, it just sat there for, 5 or 6 years. They tried to make a go of it, making it a pumpkin farm and doing some agro-tourism, but it just didn't go. So they ended up retiring and moving on. And then the tribe looked at it and decided to go ahead and make that purchase. And what a great purchase it was. So that ad hoc agricultural group, came up with a business plan, a charter, and everything about what they wanted this piece of land to do for the community. And it was a great forethought, for these tribal counselors to create this and do that. So they had community input on, what should be done here and what it should be used for. And it was great. So they created a board, named the farm Ziibimijwang, and, created a charter and what the board was supposed to do. So here is a quick photo of what it kind of looks like now. Gitigaan is the word for farm. Here we have a couple of high 30 by 100 and 30 by 200 foot hoop houses. And then in the snowy picture down in the bottom, we are putting up a 30 by 75 foot greenhouse during the winter time. It was really, really cold 2 years ago when that happened. But so with that, we that first board, really, took that business plan and tried to, follow it to a T. They were looking at growing hay, they were looking at growing wheat, looking at growing sweet corn, they were looking at growing barley, and all this big commercial stuff. Because when they bought the farm literally had, 2 big, huge Massey Ferguson tractors and big implements, and all the water infrastructure was there, because the old farmers would get their water from the river and pump it out, and then they had the big wheels that would come and water their crops. And it was just a real traditional farm. And so they tried, and they didn't have a lot of experience. It was just a lot of good citizens who wanted to make a go of it and felt strongly about providing food security and food sovereignty for Little Traverse. So here, I like to, when I talk about this slide here, it's really about sowing the seeds of sovereignty, because if we can't feed ourselves, how can we call ourselves sovereign? But then I also like to think of all of us as seeds. And, our job here, at Ziibimijwang is to, plant these seeds, not only into the ground, but into our citizens and into our youth coming up, and so it's really connected in that way. We're charged with, improving the health of our tribal citizens by providing healthful food and engaging in active participation in growing and gathering, to provide education, and also to provide sustenance opportunities for tribal citizens. And so I will talk about each one of these and what we've done with them over the next slides. Also, one of the things here that I really appreciated, and when we talk about coming together and working, and why I'm even here talking to the student association and whatnot, is I was at a food sovereignty summit, and someone came up to me and they're like, "Hey Joe, I know you guys got a farm, you're working on a farm, we're working with U of M right now, and Sid Martin had asked if the University of Michigan had any of the seeds, because they're talking about rematriation and repatriation of cultural artifacts, and she had asked about seeds, and so Dave Michener and Lisa Young, they got together and they came up with a list, and within that list, showed some corn, and had corn from all different communities throughout Michigan and Canada, and the surrounding Great Lakes area. So, but one of them was this Odawa corn here. I went to the next picture, and so he said, "Hey, we have like these 3 years of corn, and they're from the Harbor Springs area." And I was like, "What? Oh my goodness, this is amazing!" So, they invited me down, and I went down there and took a tour of their space, of their collections, and really that group, that day was a real special day, going down there and just being able to look at our relatives that were like we like to consider in jail, because they're locked away in these vaults, they're covered in plastic, and no one has seen them, and they've just been in the dark for what, 70 years right now, it looks like. So it was a pretty emotional day for everyone that attended, to go see that. But with it being emotional, it was also very encouraging, because the University of Michigan was, interested in, when I say university, I'm going to say Dave Michener, working with the university to get them to come along with us on this, was to take some of these seeds that were in the collections and try to grow them back out. And so that was a very so when we talk about the Indigenous Collaborative Garden, this is what we're trying to do, is build these relationships between these tribes who have had agricultural histories. So here in this picture, we have a picture of the last group from last summer that we came together and we did a harvest, because we came together in the spring. We did ceremony, and then we looked at some seeds that were brought together, and we grew them in a collaborative way. You can see in this bottom picture down here, we literally have some students and some of us listening to some teachings by Punkin Shinanaquit, and about what we're doing. So the students at U of M went ahead and continued to grow out these seeds that were there. And here in the picture on the right, we have a bunch of Quaywalk working together, getting their hands, and because they're very integral when it comes to planting corn and crops in general. The Quake, they hold the water of life to them, and so for them to carry seeds and plant seeds is just part of who they are. So to have the Quaywalk do this work, again, brings them back and connects them back to the land. So carry on to what they're growing right there. That's a Red Lake flint corn. But really, to come back to this next one again real quick, with the 3 ears of corn on the left, those are the first ones I saw. And then, through digging, they came up with some more corn. So you look on the right-hand side, they have some popcorn there that was also, came from this area. But the thing I like to talk about this a lot is because the woman who donated them was Jane Edwigijik. And she, is here in this picture on the bottom left-hand side with her husband, Fred, and her 2 sons. But the guy on the right is her grandson, Andrew. And he sits on the board of Ziibimijwang. And he, is a chef and has worked in the restaurant industry for years. And when we were looking at board members to fill the board, his name popped up. It's like, here's a guy, who's, tribal, has a passion for food and can cook. And, so we went and talked to Andrew, and he decided to, make a commitment and join the board. And then when I told him about this, I don't know, maybe a year later after he'd been on there, it just totally blew his mind. He was just like, what? We got corn. My grandma gave corn to the U of M because she was an anthropologist. So when she came up here in the 40s to study the Indians, that's when she went ahead and met Fred, and then they started their relationship. And she stayed up here and finished her degree, but she did a lot of great work, with U of M and documenting, the history from here up in Harbor Springs. So to see that work right there, I feel Andrew's really connected to this. We had to go and talk with the family as well, because the family was the one who were connected to the corn because it came from her hands. And so, we had to talk and see what they wanted to do with this corn. Did they just want to, leave it there and keep it as a specimen, or did they want to grow it out? And so, I left that up to Andrew to go, work with his family on that. And, talking with them, they were very, very positive on trying to grow it out, because that's part of the Indigenous collaborative garden, is to try to grow these seeds that we're connected to and bring them back to the community. Now, we all know here with one, it only takes one seed. This one seed could grow of corn, and we will baby it and nurture it. But if we can get one seed to germinate and grow, we can go ahead and save it and then grow it for next year. So that's one of the things that we're hoping that will happen here pretty soon with this. We've done, like I said, we've done some other seeds, through this program, and I'll have those stories a little bit later. But here, I really, I think it's amazing to have the work that Jane did. She did recordings. She would just come into a house, a friend's house, and she'd bring a recorder, and people would just come in off the street and tell her stories, and tell her stories of like how the corn came to be, or Nanabuju stories. And it was pretty interesting to hear all those things, and she, about the corn dance and all these little things that we've lost over the years. Thanks to her foresight in recording those, we do still have the ability to learn those and bring that back to the community. So this is the next story I'm talking about here with the Indigenous Collaborative Garden. The man in the red is Jack Desjarlais. And he had grown this corn, and he came there and shared a story with us that he had grown this specific variety of Red Lake flint corn for 40 years. And he's been the caretaker of it. And he, caretaking, the person from him was his dad and his dad. And so they have always grown this very specific variety of flint corn. So he had donated some to the university to grow out into the indigenous food, the Indigenous Collaborative Garden. And that was grown out last year. So when we came in last fall, we all came back together. We had a harvest feast. But then, Jack, took his time, and we braided these corn together, and he gave them out to the different communities that were there. Walpole Island, us here at Little Traverse, Dan Cornelius out in like Oneida. And with this corn, he had just asked us, not to, like sell the corn seed, because he wanted to keep it as pure as possible and not have it get into the hands of like, Montesano and whatnot. But here in the picture, we have a lady from Walpole Island, Tanya. And, you know, when he gifted her, you know, this braid of corn for her to take back to her community, because a lot of the corn that they have in the collection is also from Walpole Island, and they have a very deep connection to the land and to the corn themselves. But just like us, you know, they've lost a lot of that stuff. So for her to come here and be part of this and be gifted that braid of corn, you can see that she is really, really happy about this and how it's touched her. And so this year, she got to grow that corn out. And it's been kind of cool to keep up with them, with the people who have grown this corn out this year for us. And, you know, she thinks she's babied them too much, but I was like, no, you know, they're good. But yeah, she's very happy with growing it, you know, and she's bringing this stuff back to her community. And, you know, she does husking bees and they make hominy. And that was one of the things that, you know, Jack had kind of requested from us, is that, again, we don't sell the seed and we don't give the seed away. You know, this is for us to grow, and we can go ahead and, you know, turn it into hominy. We can go ahead and, you know, make different products with it. But, you know, he just asked for us to keep it for ourselves and grow. So this little braid here on the bottom, that's the braid that I was gifted to bring up here to Ziibimijwang and grow. So you kind of look at the following pictures. This is kind of what we grew out from that braid, turned into all of these braids in these pictures. And if you look at the picture behind me in my video, that's 45 braids of corn from that one little braid over there. So, you know, we had an outstanding year for growing the Menominee, and we're very, very, very thankful that he entrusted us to, you know, protect, you know, these seeds. And I have been very, 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 very protective of these seeds. You know, when we even, you know, put them into the garden. So the next one I want to kind of talk about here real quick is this next picture here. And I just want to talk about, again, how we're all connected. So with this, you know, working with the University of Michigan, you know, my mom, she's done a lot of work in genealogy and with Burt Lake, and, you know, that's just something that she's always been really interested in. But Jasmine, who gave us the land acknowledgement earlier today, her and Justin Shell were working on this program to digitize these papers. And so through, you know, them going through these old papers and digitizing them, they came through a couple of names that they had recognized, and they contacted the people in this paper. Well, this paper was written by Homer Pinkley, and it was Native American plants and uses that he had wrote back in the 60s. And he came out to Burt Lake, which is on the shores of Burt Lake, but in Sheboygan. And, you know, he interviewed all of these tribal people out there and about, you know, these plants and these issues, or these, the uses for them. And so one of them that was in the book was Annie Midwagon. And I was like, oh, wow. I mean, I know who that is. That's my grandma, or my great grandma. And so it was kind of weird how it all came to be. My mom had recognized, or my mom had saw this paper years before when Burt Lake was going through their recognition process, or still going through the recognition process. But she had saw it. And so one of the things here is, like, I never got to meet my great grandmother. I've heard lots and lots of stories from you know, people around the area about my great grandmother, and how she was, you know, the medicine woman who would, you know, travel all through the Upper Peninsula and, you know, Michigan, and, you know, providing services for those who needed it. So it was pretty interesting to see some of the stuff. And I've saw a couple of these pictures before, but when I don't know. I guess I'd have to ask maybe Jasmine a little bit more how it came to be for them to talk to Homer. But I think they called up Homer, found out he was still alive, and started a conversation there about this. So, are you still here, Jasmine? Can you add a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So my colleague, Justin Shell, was working on a project to digitize papers and came across this. And so we wanted to make sure that once we found Homer, that we spoke with him and tried to make sure that we could get his research materials back to the Little Traverse Bay Band. And so from there, we contacted Eric Hemingway from the Archives and Records Department and was working with him in addition, or to help kind of facilitate finding some other people named in the paper. And it was wonderful to meet Joey based on this project and to reunite families with these items that might not have been found if they had remained kind of hidden in collections. So just very serendipitous for us all to be here now today. So I think that answers that.
Thank you, Jasmine. And so that was, and again, so that was the thing. It kind of came to me, and I was very interested because they was like, oh, they said they had pictures, they had baskets, they had medicines. And I was like, oh, my great grandma was really known for her baskets as well, and like her medicines. And come to find out, the baskets weren't from her. Bummer. But what was there was medicines. And so to have those medicines that she's touched and went out and foraged for herself, means a lot to me. And to know that her hands worked on this to make people better. So it was very cool. I showed this work to my mom, and my mom was just like, ecstatic, like, oh my God, this is so cool, and I showed her some of these pictures of all that he had in the slides, and she knew everybody in the picture. She knew who they were. And then I had asked her if she saw some of them, and she's like, I saw a couple, but these two here of my great grandmother on the porch, she didn't. She had never saw those ones before. The one that she does have hanging up in her house is kind of the one on the right here with Homer. That's her and Homer, talking. He's actually holding some sweetgrass in his hand that he purchased from her, or she was gifted. We don't exactly know that yet, but he had a sweetgrass table runner mat made out of it. So in these photos, there was a picture of a little girl, and the team didn't know who it was. They kind of wondered, who it was. When I showed them the pictures, my mom was like, "Hey, that's me." And so here on the picture is a picture of my mom now, and she is holding a elm bark basket that she made. So it's kind of cool for her to see that, and for her, and she would tell me stories as well about Grandma Annie, and that's what we'd call her. So I just think it's cool how this all serendipity, that big word, worked out here for us to come together. So all very, very amazing. So one of the things we do here at Ziibimijwang is we learn a lot from people, but then we also like to share what we know. And so we've worked alongside other tribes. We've taken tours of other tribal farms and worked with other tribal farmers to learn and gain that knowledge back. So back in 2017, I had a request from Gary Besaw, who was the chairman of Menominee at the time, to come and take a visit. He'd seen what we've been doing, And he was like, Joe, I just want to come visit your farm and look at what you guys are doing. You guys are doing amazing work over there. And, I'm trying to get my tribe to, work, in this aspect as well. And I was like, hey, well, come on over and, I'll give you a tour. So on this tour here, I did, take him up 119, which is the oldest state highway in Michigan, but it literally runs up the coast of Little Traverse Bay in Michigan. And it's the old trail where our village is said to run through that whole area. But here, is a sign of the old council tree. And it talks about the chiefs of the Menominee and the Ojibwe and the Bwaachwe having councils there. So, when I took them there to see that, because here I have Menominee coming over, and I just thought this would be powerful for them to see. So here's a group that came over here to look and explore and see and talk with us with what we're doing. And it was a cold, amazing day and muddy day because it was in the spring. But here in the bottom, one of the attendees, Lydie Rogers, had wrote this the summary of her experience and what this experience meant for her and what she did. And so I included this quote down there for her, and it reads, it was so powerful to read these words, knowing that the Menominee and the Odawa people had worked in this spot for many generations in the past. People on the tour reflected on this, that it was helping sustain collaboration between these two tribes in the present day. Again, it was a great day of working together. I talked to Gary a little bit earlier today on other things that we're collaborating on nationally as well. So, Menominee has been a great partner with us and working, and that's what we really want to show to everyone else, is that, what we learned, we want to share with you as well. And, we just want to, keep giving back to the community. So some of the things that we do out at Ziibimijwang, instead of just growing produce, everything from arugula to zucchini, as KK, our farm manager, would say, we do provide opportunities to learn and cultural activities to learn out at Ziibimijwang. So here, as a picture, we have a big, huge red barn, and in that red barn, we're like, hey, we can host activities in here. So one of the things, we held a lacrosse stick making workshop. So we took the youth, we went out and, harvested an ash tree that was still good. And we brought that back and, worked for the youth for, one day we went out to go get it. The next day we came back, and we built these lacrosse sticks. It was a great event. We built 2 sets worth. Everyone went home with one. But it was just a great experience to see people coming together, laughing, working. The older generation with the youth and the younger generation, and that was just a great day. We play games all throughout the year. During the winter, we'll go to the local high school or middle school, and we'll play lacrosse indoors. During the summer, we'll go out to the powwow grounds or some other fields, and play Bag It Away. And really, bringing Bag It Away back to our community is also important. We're very near, Mackinac City, and one of the the most famous lacrosse games in the country happened there. Granted, we weren't a part of it and we're pretty upset, but it happened in our backyard with the taking of Fort Michilimackinac. And but it's great to see youth gravitate back towards this sport again, and play it and know that they're connected. The next picture, the other activity that we do is, of course, Ziibimijwang's 300 acres. We have a lot of deer out there, Bwaachwe. And so they were getting into, our fields and, eating our crops, and, you can't do that because, we have to go to farmers markets and sell. So we went to our natural resource department and we said, hey, can we get some permits? We want to go out and harvest some deer at night, so they can, stop eating our crops. We'll put up a fence next year, but this year we needed to do that. So they gave us some permits. We went out and we had harvested deer. We showed the youth how to, butcher it, skin it down. But then we also decided to have a drum making class with it. So we showed them how to, tan the hide, skin it, and then, to make the frames and put it together. We just had another really good turnout there. And you can see in this picture all the happy smiling faces. Everyone got to go home with a drum. And this is things that, we want to continue doing out at Ziibimijwang, bringing the youth out and the elders to help continue teaching us these ways. Some of the other things that we've done very culturally, we've had harvest feast. We've had a Three Sisters harvest feast. That's something that we feel is very important, is to bring the community back together again, and teach them what we know, and so they can be so they can see what we're doing, because a lot of times, if they don't see it, they just think we're taking money or doing other stuff. And so we bring people back, and it's been very, very rewarding. We've had 3 harvest feasts. We have a spring planting where we bring the community out, and they plant the Three Sisters garden. We do ceremony. We have a pipe ceremony, we have a water ceremony, and we use the water from the Zibi from the Carp River to put in the fields, because we feel that is the water that needs to be there for there. So it's very special when the women do walk down to the water and they grab their pails, and they fill it with water and bring it back up for the ceremony. So yeah. So these cultural activities that we do here, we have a picture on the left of a group of like a lot of the farm hands from 2019. And that was a great day coming together. We braided corn, we made hominy, we feasted, and we laughed and shared stories. And I think, people really need to see that and feel that. So again, here, I'm going to probably point some people out, but on this right hand picture here, where everyone's shelling the corn, I do have 2 of Jane's granddaughters, which would be Andrew's sisters there. One's Jennifer and Stacy. So even for them being out there, I think it's amazing, because they get to come out here and be a part of this as well, and they get to connect to their grandma in a different way. So some more stuff that we've done, for the community is we do professional development. We bring the staff from our government center out, and they have professional development days, to learn about what other things are doing. So for 2 days, they had buses come out, and we, took them around, Ziibimijwang and showed them everything that we're doing. Of course, we put in some free work for them. So, we got some free labor, but we taught them how, we would traditionally dry squash. And so they got, they all got to participate in that. And that was, a fun day for them to see how things were done that way. Something else that we talked about, is trade routes. I've included 2 pictures here. One's a historical picture on the left of, our trade routes throughout the Great Lakes region. The Dawa were known, that's our job as being the middle brother, is to trade and to be the businessmen. And today, again, doing what I do for a living is not, it feels natural to me to do this and work here with the community and work out through the Great Lakes and all across Indian country. So On the right-hand side, the picture there, I have a picture of our reservation. It's in the yellow. Those little black dots, that's the land that we actually own. And then the blue dots up in the very tip of the mitt is Mackinac City. That's where we have our store in Menominee. The bigger blue dot, that's the 300-acre farm Ziibimijwang. And then you come down into the bay. We have Harbor Springs, which we are planning on putting a market in there as well. Petoskey, we have a market in there. And when I say market, I'm talking farmers market. And then Charlevoix, which is way over on the left-hand side as well by the Pine River. We have a market there. And then at Boyne City, down in the bottom. So this is one of the things we've talked about is how do we, get food to, our tribal citizens? How do we, because, we're spread out all over the state, we're spread out all over the country, and we're spread out all over the reservation. I know one of the things we had talked about was food deserts, and what's considered a food desert is being in a rural area and being 10 miles away from the nearest grocery store. And so the nearest grocery store here would be Harbor Springs and Petoskey and Charlevoix. But those were, where the people are at. Mackinac City has a small little grocery store, but that's about it. And so we were thinking like, how do we, get this food out to tribal citizens? We did have a farmers market out at our government center for a couple of years. That was done for by a grant, or a REACH grant. And then when that grant kind of ended, so did the farmers market there as well. But we've struggled on. I think one of the things, I didn't talk about earlier was, the formation of the board and, what we've done since then. Because one of the things we looked at is when the farm came into existence, they had hired a farm manager to run the farm, but he owned his own farm, and he said, I would just come out here, and you guys buy the seeds, I'll plant it, and then you'll have your tribal citizens come out here and pick it. Well, I'm pretty sure we paid him, and I wasn't on the board at the time yet, so but they paid him $26,000 to grow like 4 rows of tomatoes, and that just wasn't acceptable. There was a lot of like dissension on the board about what was going on and what was happening. And so, people started leaving, and then I got asked, would I like to sit on the board? And I said, sure, why not? At the time, I was the National Association president for the food distribution programs. So, I was traveling all across the country, and, coming back and chairing this board, I thought, well, I'll just be on the board and offer my, contacts. Well, then when it came, election time came up for the board, and the other chair, she decided she wasn't going to run again. So everyone left the board except for me and Blaine, and it was just us two. And we were like, oh, what are we going to do with this? And so we sat down and we talked about, what we wanted to do with Ziibimijwang, because what the business plan had said to do wasn't necessarily working out. And so we went out and recruited some new board members at the time. And again, we all sat down, we talked about it, we put them on the board. And one would be Kevin Donner, Rebecca Otto, Blair Miller. And that was the original board for quite a long time. But we looked at what we wanted to do, and we decided that, we couldn't wholesale a lot of the produce in farms, because that wasn't taking care of the land. You're just going to go out there and, plow up the land, and, it just wasn't profitable, because part of that is we're nonprofit. So, any money that we make just goes back into ourselves. But we also have to be able to, give back to the community. And, since we're owned by the tribe, the tribe does work with us with a budget, but they told us they wanted us to be self-sufficient, and go out. So what do? We're like, oh, well, we got to make money, we got to get our name out. We have to have people buy our produce. So we do have, that other component to Ziibimijwang, is the side that we go out and really market, our fresh produce, at the markets. And so we hired a farm manager. He did a great job for that 1 year. He did such a great job that he left. But the farm he left had said, hey, I'll give you half the farm if you come back. And he chose to do that because he knew that Ziibimijwang would never be his land. And so he left, and then we hired another farm manager to come in, and he left us right at the end of the season. And so it kind of left us in a bind. We didn't know what to do. We put out applications to hire a new farm manager, and finally, by the beginning of the growing season, we had found somebody. We hired them, and they did a good job of growing the produce, but they just couldn't sell the produce. And so, we had to go back to tribal council and ask for more money. And the tribal council, it's not a well for money, but the way we look at it is like, hey, you get a return on your investment, but the money that you're putting into this stuff, it is the tribes. So, one of the things we had to overcome is they literally drove the wheels off the tractor, and we didn't have any tractors. And so we had to go back to council and ask them for money for a tractor, and they were gracious enough to buy us a tractor, and we continued on doing what we're doing. We've worked with different partners like NRCS, USDA for grants to help, put like those hoop houses and greenhouses in there. So what happened after that, the next farmer, she did her best. And so she ended up leaving as well. And then that's when I had hired KK to come in. And KK was this farm. He's from Ghana, but he worked at Pond Hill Farm. Pond Hill Farm is one of the most successful farms in the Harbor Springs or the tip of the Mitt area. They basically started out as just a simple farm, and now they have a winery or brewery. Very big in agritourism that they do, and they still, sell a lot of their vegetables. They have a store where they, take their vegetables and can them and, sell them to the public. And so, but I had managed to talk KK out of that job but he'd been there for 14 years. And it was just time for him to, kind of, move on and see what else he could do. So, I brought KK on. We brought on Rosebud. We brought her all the way from Detroit to come up and, work at Ziibimijwang. And since then, our last 2 years, we have grown by leaps and bounds, having these two work with us. And, I'm going to sit here and talk about Menominee Market real quick because I mentioned Rosebud. But since, we're in the tip of the Mitt and the trade routes up here, going to go back to the dollar trade route, that's the hub for all of trading. And so, when we were sitting there one day, we we're talking about, what are we going to do? I'm like, let's be that hub again. Let's be that hub for the food and trading throughout the area. And they kind of looked at me crazy, and I was like, no, that's what we do. We can, sell our products to other tribal communities, and we can, sell their products here. We can do that. We have a great place because Mackinac City during the summertime, just as it was since time immemorial, has always been a great meeting place. So people from all across the country and all across the world come to Mackinac Island and Mackinac City and St. Ignace. They come to that area. And so, they were like, oh, wow, that's a great idea. And so they're like, what do we do? Well, at the time, the tribe had a fish market. They had purchased from Bell's fishery from Bell's so many years ago. And what happened is this fishery just never got up and made it. And so the fishery closed. And granted, at this point in time, we're still looking at different options, but this building sat here empty. And we're like, hey, what can we do with this building? And we're like, let's turn it into a store. Let's turn it into a place where we can sell our products. Let's turn it into a place where, you know, people can come and meet and, you know, try our food and eat, because here they had like a little restaurant in it as well. And we're like, you know, we think we can do that. So we went to tribal council and we asked them if we could have access to that property. There was 2 other tribal entities that wanted that building. One was our environmental services. They just wanted to basically tear it down and fix the land underneath it. Because here in this very particular space off to the right, before the Mackinac Bridge was there, the ferries used to go back and forth. And this was the gas station for the ferries right there on the right-hand side. So a lot of this ground was contaminated. And, you know, our environmental services department, you know, they wanted to go in there and clean up that ground and, you know, make it good. Because again, we're connected to the land. So that was one fight that we had to work with. And then our other, you know, corporation that wanted it, they just wanted to bulldoze it all over and turn it into a parking lot and charge people to park there, because Menominee, or not Menominee, but Mackinac City needed parking, and they thought they could do that. So we all went to tribal council, we haggled it out, and tribal council said, hey, you know, Ziibimijwang, you guys are doing great work, you guys have great ideas, and, you know, we really do think that, you know, you guys could be the center of the trade again. So here's the building, you know. So we worked with the Michigan Economic Development Committee, and we received a grant to go ahead and refurbish this building and add signage and repaint it and bring it up to code. You know, and that one was a grant where we literally had to pay for it up front, and then they just reimbursed us. So, you know, that did take quite a bit of money. We still have, I think, $60,000 to spend on that, but, you know, it's good. So here with Menominee, one of the things is we had to get certified through the state because we're not on tribal trust land. And that's kind of worked out for us as well, because once you're certified by the state, people tend to believe that you guys are very good, which we are. I'm not saying we're not, but, you know, it gives us that added extra layer. So with Menominee, we offer fish. We work with a local fishery to provide smoked fish, fish dip, fillets. And the reason why we work with that one is because we don't have a fishery anymore. But our tribal fishermen sell to that person. So we figured if we're gonna, you know, support our tribal fishermen, we're gonna buy from where he's selling his fish to. And inside, you know, we have all of our maple syrup equipment in there as well, because we do make maple sugar, maple candies, and other different maple products throughout on the inside there. So the other thing, again, you know, we wanted it to be a space where we could not only sell our stuff, but sell stuff throughout, you know, the country. Because, you know, there's a lot of tribes that are doing very good things, and they're making their own products. And, you know, they're looking for outlets to sell. And so we tasked Rosebud, our market manager, with, you know, finding those companies and putting those companies in our store. So we also have tribal citizens. They come in and they, you know, we will showcase their artwork for them. We'll put it inside the store, and then people will buy their artwork. And so, you know, and that just gives tribal citizens a place to come and, you know, sell their stuff as well. So we have, I think, 15 different tribal vendors that we sell throughout the store, through t-shirts and stickers and food and wash, like different foods, Tonka Bar, Red Lake Fishery, or like Red Lake Fishery, not fisheries, but Red Lake jams or foods, the 7th generation cleansing products. We Nate Wright, who does different salves and whatnot. And so we worked with all these companies in there to sell their product as well. So, but due to COVID this year, we did not open up Menominee, because we were trying to be as safe as possible. And with that, it allowed us to really concentrate on Ziibimijwang this year. But we'll be opening back up in the spring as soon as the snow breaks. Again, so here's some of the products. I kind of jumped ahead of myself with what we've done in here. The one picture on the right is we do go to powwows, and we bring our market to the powwows. And it was very encouraging last year or the year before COVID, going to the powwows, because a lot of people were like, this is so nice not to have to eat fry bread or fry bread tacos. We can eat, fresh, healthy food, because our store, we can cater, we can bring that stuff down as well. And so we brought, all this stuff down to the powwows, and they came over and got to eat fresh, organic food. And they just thought it was amazing. So again, COVID this year kind of put a stop to all of that. But we have worked with other tribal governments. We've worked with our elders department to provide food boxes for our elders for the holidays. And, we're still going to continue to do that. Here's some of our products that I was talking about. Ziibimijwang, we make maple sugar. That is our bread and butter. As being from Odawa, we have always been known for Ziibimijwang. That's what we traded. That's what we made. A lot of people really think that it was maple syrup. And trying to travel throughout the Great Lakes with a liquid is very hard. So that's why they made the sugar into the cakes and candies, because it was easier to carry than a liquid. So when it came down time to figure out that we wanted to be known again as traders and be known for sugar, we took it to the elders. We asked them. There were some people who thought that it was a very sacred food item and that we shouldn't sell it. And then there's others who were like, that's what we've done. We sold and we traded this all throughout the Great Lakes region. So you have our blessing. And so we've done that, and it's been the biggest boon for us. We every year at our community meeting, we bring 300 pounds of sugar to the community meeting to give away. There's only one requirement, is you have to tell us a story about it, especially with the elders, of what they remember with Ziibimijwang and what they used it. And then of course that just makes it so much better, because then they tell you all kinds of stories of what they used to use it for, how they would make it, and then it reminded them of their family members who would make it. And it's really how do I say, it really means a lot to me to see this and to carry these stories forward, for these elders. So one of the things here too that we're looking at, is this corn that we're growing. And we've ate corn. Corn has been very integral part of our ceremonies with our corn soup. So bringing that corn back from the U of M is going to be really, really, really satisfying for us to actually, taste that corn that our ancestors ate as well. So on the picture here on the left is a picture of corn mush that I recently ate. We came up with, after some conversations about talking with how it was, this is how it came out without the egg. I just added the egg because I like egg. But this will be our newest product that we'll be coming out with to the community. I think, and Andrea and I, we had talked about this earlier about, how do we get people to eat these foods that they're not necessarily accustomed to eating, you know. And that's a great question. I'll probably answer it a little bit later, but we have to start small with them and, you know, get them reacquainted with it and to understand that, you know, it is a good, healthy food, but you do have to work for it. You know, the legend of or how maple syrup came to be, you know, the Nanabuju story is very indicative of what people have to do to work to earn that food. So extended family here. This picture goes to what I was talking about with food and getting it out there for people to eat. We have a picture of Rosebud with some Gitigaan standing next to Chef Sean Sherman. You know, he has used our products in his cooking demos and his cooking presentations. And so, you know, it's very nice to work with him on what we do and what we share. On the right-hand side, we do have Chef Brian Yazzie, you know, showcasing some maple cream. And he uses our products very extensively as well. And he's always out advertising and, you know, showing what we have. So it's very important, you know, for us community or extended family to work together to sell and produce and to cook and use and eat and try things in different ways. One of the things here, you know, again, like for me is I have a picture here of a Gitigaan. You know, I came back from a food sovereignty summit and I saw the Gitigaan and I was just like, man, I was like, I've never saw one of those before. I think it's, you know, interesting. So I came back and I went to our archives and records department and I asked the worker in there at the time, Jordan, I said, hey, what do you know about Gitigaans? You know? And she's like, I don't know, let me look. And then she like a light went off and she's like, I showed her a picture and she's like, oh, wait. And like she runs into the back and comes back out with this Gitigaan, this picture of this Gitigaan. And to me, that was a really strong moment again, because it reaffirmed of what we did as a tribe in agriculture, you know, because, you know, a lot of people say we just hunted. Well, no, you know, we were farmers. Just because we didn't plant and rows didn't mean we didn't farm. So, you know, seeing this picture of this Gitigaan really made me happy. So one of the things is, again, here, you know, out at Ziibimijwang, we want to be able to teach people how to use these old tools again. And so here's the picture of the Gitigaan, and I'm making, well, not me, but making, you know, corn mush flour. So what else we got here? There we go. I finally got on to the next one. I just wanted to talk about my team here at the end. The picture on the left is a picture of the board working together. We went out and when we planted our first Three Sisters garden, we all went out there and planted it together. So that was a very good day of us just, you know, putting our good thoughts and intentions into the ground and into the land. And then on the right hand side, I have a picture of myself, Blue, KK, and Rosebud. This is when we went to Duluth for the first ever tribal food expo, traditional food expo in Duluth. Again, that's part of us traveling and, you know, bringing our wares over there and sharing throughout Indian country. And we had a great time there. We did very well. I think that trip we went from Duluth all the way down to Oneida to their food sovereignty summit, and then back across. So it's fun doing that. And Rosebud, she recently just did it again with Chef Elena Terry. They did a producer, chef, and growers or farmers tour, and so they went and toured all these farms across the U.S. and they went all the way to Oregon. So that was good, and they came back. They did quarantine and take a test, so they don't have no COVID, just an FYI. But it was very good for us to, go out there and do that and continue building those relations with those other farmers and producers and chefs throughout the country and support the work that they're doing. So I think that's about it right now. I'm going to drink a little bit of water, but is there any questions?
We also want to invite people to not only share their questions in the chat, but also to come off mute and share your questions.
So one of the questions that we got earlier in the night was from Kisa Johnson, who asked how many people are a part of Ziibimijwang?
How many people are part of it? It ranges, because obviously it's seasonal workers. Right now the most I think we've ever had was 13 employees out there. And one of the things, that we do is we work with, we try to give tribal citizens jobs and first generation descendants jobs and to come out there and work. So the most we've ever had was 13. The crew we have right now, because it's again end of the year, KK, Rosebud Blue, Montana, and Rebecca. So we have 5 right now, and so we have 5 right now. But then during the spring, it'll get bigger as well.
The next question comes from Anna. She asked, how much of the braid that you were gifted did you grow out this year?
Ooh, good question, Anna. I think that braid that we were gifted, we did the ceremony with it, and I would probably say, because you only do the center part of the corn, when you do it. So it was probably a pound, I would say, of seed that they did. Unless I don't know, I don't see who else is on here.
So that's me, Joey. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I know you, Anna.
Yes. So did you use all of your middle corn, or did you use like a portion of the middle corn? Like, do you have more of the original stuff that you were gifted, or is that that, I guess that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, so we do have a jar left over because one of the things is when we grow for the seed, we do want to keep some back just in case the year wasn't good. So we have some to plant for the next year, and that's part of the seed keeping process. But looking at what's behind me right there, we had an amazing year with what was grown. So
That's so amazing. That's so awesome. I did not have a good year, so it's really, really wonderful to see that.
Another question comes from Tim. Is Ziibimijwang's land in trust with the federal government?
yes, it is.
I think that's so cool. We have another question from Steve Monaghan, which asks, when we can gather again, what's the possibility of doing an event for our students on campus with dining and your produce? So I guess asking how you event.
Yeah, so we've hosted conference tours. So if you've been to a conference and they've taken you on a tour somewhere, we've hosted those before, so we do have the ability to do both. And actually right now we are getting ready to build a little teaching pavilion as well out there for us to gather in. One of the things we're looking at in the future is, we do want to host a food sovereignty summit, but we're just putting the infrastructure in right now, slowly but surely, because nothing necessarily happens overnight. So that's our goal within 5 years, is to be able to host a food sovereignty summit. And But for you, to come when we can gather again, just contact me, and then I'll send it down to Rosebud and KK, and we can set it all up for you.
Another question comes from Jonathan K. He says, I apologize if I missed this, but besides opening back up in the spring, what other goals are you hoping to aim for in the future?
So, with just Menominee, opening up, we're really trying to, work on the food aspect at Menominee, and using more traditional foods, because, from a businessman sense, it is a niche, but also, having our tribal citizens eat that as well. One of the things too, another goal is to really work on, there's an area down by the river where we kind of want to turn it into a traditional village, like, a fishing camp village, or a summer camp, where we'd come in and, we'd have, we'd go out into the forest, and we'd harvest all the stuff to make, the wigwams and stuff like that. So, we're looking at that. And that the other thing we're kind of looking at, the other goal to be set is, how do we help, all of our tribal citizens throughout the country? And that's a question that, we're still kind of like, figuring out through, because, tribal citizens throughout the country, always are asking like, well, how can I get food, or how can I get this, and I mean, I love to help them. I want to help them. But, just, shipping, fresh produce, in the mail that way isn't very conducive to keeping it fresh. So we're looking at different ways to, be able to help those tribal citizens out. Being nonprofit, we're still, in my day job, I'm the food distribution program director for the tribe. And, and what that means really is commodities. And everyone talks about commodities and how bad it is. But it's not that anymore. It's not, we have fresh produce, low salt, no fat, food in commodities, and we don't call it commodities anymore. It's food distribution. So, and that brings me back to the next goal of what we're doing, is working through the Farm Bill. The USDA has authorized a 638 contracting provision, which would actually allow the tribe itself to contract with Ziibimijwang, the farm, to provide food for the food distribution program that I run. So it's kind of all connected on that way. And that, I had a consultation call earlier today on that, but that's something that we think is great, because it's going to provide economic, stability or economic development for us, as a whole. But then it also gets that food into our tribal citizens' mouth. One of the things is we worked with Groundworks this summer in the very beginning of COVID, and they raised over $100,000 for local farmers. And they took that money and they bought produce from all the local farmers, and then they took it to Mana, which is the local food pantry, and then all that food got given out to all the area residents who needed food. We worked with Dave Covey from the Covey farm right up the road for the Farmers and Family Food Box. So this is another way we decided to get food into our citizens' mouths this year. So he purchased a bunch of food from us, from Ziibimijwang, carrots, radishes, lettuces, and he put them in the food box. And then he gave the food box back to us. And then we gave the food out to all of the tribal citizens, and there was like no income requirement. So everyone, got to eat some more of our food that we produced this year. So, but the biggest goal is to be able to work with the tribe and have 638 contracting, where we can, have a steady supply of food coming into our food distribution program. Any more?
At the moment, no, but we want to hold space and say if there's any more questions, you have a little bit of time left. Jeremy did say, going back to Steve's question or suggestion, they would be happy to work with M Dining to host a dinner for NASA students and guests at the campus farm with Joe and his team as special guests. If folks are interested, we can chat after.
Yeah, we can do that.
Well, if there are no other questions, on behalf of our sponsors and the University of Michigan, I'd like to say thank you to Jill Van Alstyne, for sharing your knowledge with us today. We would also like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We would also like to invite you, Joe, to share any closing remarks with the group this evening.
I just did.
Okay.
Miigwech. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that game's Saturday, right?
Yeah.
No, but really, the biggest thing is, we are connected to the land and to what we do, and we do have a responsibility to, the food that we grow, and to our tribal citizens that we also help grow. So, with that, support your local farmer, support your local tribal business, and go to www.ziibimijwang.com, which is our new, website. So, but if you have any questions, go ahead and, email them to me. We can put our contact information out there as well.
Okay, thank you. So while we're gonna get the contract information in the chat soon, but we would like to once again thank Joe here for sharing your time and knowledge with us. Please, once again, check out Ziibimijwang's website and learn more to support the farm. Also be sure to visit the Native American Heritage Month website for the most up-to-date information on NAM events. Looking ahead, we have a collaboration with Latinx Heritage Month this coming Sunday, November 1st at 6 p.m., where we will be celebrating and learning more about Ghost Supper and Dia de los Muertos with Sacramento Knox from the Gitigaan. We hope you can join us.
There is a survey link being sent out in the chat as well as via email. Please complete this so we can continue to show the university why events like this are so important. Thanks again for joining us today, and thank you again to Joe for sharing your knowledge with us.
Miigwech.
As just a last reminder, since this is one of our last events before Election Day, which is on Tuesday, we just wanted to encourage everyone to exercise your democratic right and make your voice heard by voting. With that, we hope you all have a great rest of your week and happy Native American Heritage Month.
Bwaachwe.
Bwaachwe.